And then one of the things you do when you get there is you file a lawsuit against the speaker.
Yeah, well, that was a little later. That was like 5 years later. Yes, but when the 1980, it wasn't that much longer than this matter now that you mention it, because it was the 80 reapportionment. So the lawsuit was filed in 1982 when they actually, did it. When they went to reapportion the state legislature, my own party won the. In Illinois, we have a tradition that the parties pull a piece of paper out of Abraham Lincoln's hat, literally. So you go into Abraham Lincoln's hat and pull out this piece of paper to determine who gets the right to draw the lines if there's a tie, and that's what happened. So the Democrats drew Abraham Lincoln's hat, got the favor of the hat that time, and drew the maps. And the maps as drawn absolutely eliminated any Hispanic representation, even though we had two huge Hispanic communities in Chicago, and minimized to the absolute fewest number of seats possible the seats in which blacks could likely elect a representative. And it was just wrong. And so, I did what I could as fighting it in the legislature through the process, and we lost. We were outvoted. And walking down the street, again, my street kept getting me in trouble. Walking down the street, and this guy with dreadlocks, who was a community activist, you know the type, right? They got long hair, the coats are too big and hanging off, and he's got books under his arms. And he says, well, this is terrible what's happened. Somebody ought to file a law. And he says, this is just a travesty, that the lines will be drawn that way. And I said, well, we tried. That's the only thing I think can happen now is that somebody files a lawsuit. And he looked at me and said, well, you're a lawyer, ain't you? I'm like, oh, well. So he sucked me in. And so I wound up, matter of fact, it was really funny because he said, well, you won't. I said, oh, I couldn't possibly, I don't have a law firm. I'm just, by myself. Oh, don't worry. We'll get you a battery of lawyers and we'll put it together. Well, he showed up that evening with a guy who also had dreadlocks, was probably high on pot and talking about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I knew I was in trouble. Right. I was like, oh, my goodness, I don't do this. So I wound up drawing the lawsuit up in my dining room table. And I had called a friend with one of the big law firms who said that he thought his firm would handle it pro bono. This is another time of serendipity played such a role in my life, because I took my papers, because the canons of ethics say you don't file lawsuits that you can't handle, and I knew there was no way that I could handle a 3-judge district court, huge litigation like this on my own. But I filed the case, and just to make the record, I think it got that much notice in the newspaper, if any. And then went down to this law firm to talk with the lawyers about what they would do to handle this reapportionment case, and they turned me down.
Really?
They said, oh no, we're not going to get in, that's too much political hot potato, and they turned me down. And I remember I was so crushed. My friend was embarrassed because he thought he had worked all this out. And I was on the verge of tears, because I knew that the only thing I could do is go up to the courtroom and withdraw. I mean, there's just no. And as I was coming down out of the elevator, I was going out just as Tom Sullivan was coming in. Tom Sullivan I'd met only on one other occasion, when I tendered my resignation to him as U.S. Attorney. Because when I left to have the baby, he came on as U.S. Attorney. So he was coming on just as I was going out the door, basically. So I'd only met him once, but he waved, and I waved back, and he said, so I went around, and he says, oh, so what are you doing these days? And, oh, well, if I got it. So I told him the reapportionment story. And he said, that sounds really interesting. Send us the papers. And Tom, at that point, was a lawyer at Jenner and Block, one of the biggest law firms in Chicago. And Jeff Coleman was with him, was his partner. I guess Jeff was his understudy, his second chair. And they took the case like 40 going north. They were both Democrats, obviously, but they thought, yes, this is the right thing to do. And they took up the case with a commitment that Dick Newhouse, also involved with this, that Dick and I stay involved, that we don't just give them the case and get lost. And we committed to do that. And I remember working harder than I probably have worked on anything in my life, because we had to coordinate. We had got community people to do the computer work. We had the first computer program for reapportionment was written by this black guy who was a street person, basically, in Chicago. And he sat there and did the math. And we put together, because they didn't have such things, the computers were so new, but he put together a program to run the numbers, the census numbers, so we could do the case. And we would spend nights sitting in my study at my house going over papers and trying to work the numbers out. And then Ethel, who was our kind of secret spy, because she was very much a part of the machine. She had been my roommate, Ethel Alexander, but she was very much a part of the machine, and so in fact was called as a witness against us. But the full story was that she had sat down with me with colored pencils one night and shown me the machine dynamics of who had done what to whom and why these lines were here and not there and how they managed to work it out. And so that allowed us to produce a theory about the case that allowed us not only to win, but we made real history, because it was the first time that a reapportionment case had been won in the North. Remember, the Voting Rights Act originally was limited just to the southern states. It was the first time the Voting Rights Act was extended. Well, it happened in two stages. We first had to make a pure 14th Amendment case, which was to say that there was deliberate discrimination, which the Speaker of the Illinois House has never forgiven me for, because the court had to say he deliberately intended to discriminate. But then after that decision by the three-judge court, the Congress acted to extend the Voting Rights Act nationwide, so the South wasn't just singled out anymore. And then under the Voting Rights Act case, really the test just got easier. But it set up really the direction that the courts have followed, well, up until fairly recently, but the courts followed for a number of years in reapportionment cases. The case was Crosby versus State Board of Elections. But the really good news, I thought, from that was not only in that case, we created the first Hispanic district ever, and which gave rise subsequently to a Hispanic coming to Congress. But we also created additional black districts in Illinois. But as much to the point, it didn't happen again. I mean, that was the last time that the party apparatus went out of their way to try to, if you will, stick it to their minority base as a way of keeping white politicians in power. I think so.
Yeah.